Okay, let's get started. I have very ambitious goals for today. I want to talk about Sydney. I want to talk about Hanukkah, and I want to finish the discourse. I think we can pull it off. So I'm actually going to tie the events of Sydney together with Hanukkah because I think that they carry essentially the same message. So the question is, why is there so much hate in the world? Why do people try to cause such harm and hurt to others? And there's all kinds of psychological, sociological attempts to explain it. And sometimes those are legitimate. In other words, sometimes it's just ignorance. People raise them in sheltered environments, then don't get the opportunity to really get exposure to the world. And that argument holds only so far, because there's a lot of things that ignorant people will do, uneducated people will do in their attempt to try to make themselves feel fit in. But there's a line that any decent, even not decent, any human being who has an anchoring in life will not do. You can hate people, you can despise them, but when you start murdering people, when you start shooting people, picking people off, there's something that is beyond rational explanation. To zoom the camera out, it's essentially the battle between evil and good. As Judaism sees the battle between evil and good, evil is not a separate power that competes with the divine power. There is no Satan that God created as an independent force that has this ability to actually battle God, that has some kind of contemporary, that is an equal battlefield in some way, or even maybe God has a little bit of the upper hand, but Satan's got a good chance. Doesn't work that way. Evil is the absence of light. Simple as that. Evil is the absence of light. Or darkness is the absence of light. And so what happens is that when darkness requires the absence of light to survive. That's a simple, it's not very sophisticated. If it's dark in the room, you turn the light on, the darkness is gone. So if you're darkness and you want to survive, the only way you can survive is if you don't let the light shine its light. And so evil, darkness, fights against light to try to eradicate it. And unfortunately, there's been a mindset that the way to navigate evil and darkness is to negotiate with it, to pacify it, to try in some way to diminish the darkness by engaging with it. And again, I think there are areas, there are gray areas where it's gray not because there's an absence of light, but because the light hasn't yet arrived there, you might say. In other words, I think there's circumstances where some good education can actually change an outcome. But we should never be afraid to call it for what it is, even if it's gray, but the actions that are coming from that gray are evil. We have to be able to call it for what it is. And if we're afraid to, then we give the darkness its power. We give darkness its capacity to further perpetrate what it wants to do. So you might even say that darkness's agenda is supra-rational or irrational, right? And I don't mean that we just gave a logical explanation for it, but it's actually a survival mechanism for darkness, right? It will do whatever it can to survive, even if it makes absolutely no sense. And in this case, absolutely makes no sense means it'll even engage in immoral behaviors. It'll even take the life of another person in order for it to survive. So the way to combat that is not through rational engagement, right? You can meet logic with logic. There's a fellow who wrote some of you might have been at his event. He spoke on Shavuot, and he spoke at an event recently here. His name is Rafi Cohen. He wrote a book called Trash Talk. Trash Talk it's not what it sounds like. Trash Talk is where you throw down the gauntlet sometimes, right? So people do this subconsciously, as you want to provoke someone. So you say something to get them fired up. And he does a lot of research in sports. You have a lot of this in professional sports where somebody will say something in order to rile the other person up, and then they can have a real good game, right? And then you want to throw them off their game by thinking you make them feel like less than, and then and you have this in debate, in sparring. You say something because you want to throw the other person off. So this fellow Rafi writes a weekly essay. So the title of his essay is, "Are some people too literal for trash talk?" Or you have to be able to see the nuance, right? If you don't see the nuance, then you say, "Oh, well, this person, we're too sensitive. You take it too seriously." When you're too literal, then you can't play in the trash talk space, because you have to have an equal sparring partner. You can't overcome an enemy if you're coming with tools that are less powerful than the enemy's. So if we are engaging emotionally, so we meet emotion with emotion. If you're engaging intellectually, you meet intellect with intellect. If you're engaging with something that is irrational, what's the counter to that? What do you have to meet that with?
Ridicule.
Okay, I like that. But I would suggest you don't meet irrational with irrational, even though it belongs to the same family. You meet irrational with super rational, which is light, right? So you meet irrational with something that you also cannot explain. The survival of darkness, of evil, the desire for survival is ready to go to all extremes beyond anything that makes sense. So the way to combat that is to do something that makes no sense, but not because it's nonsense, but because it's above sense. It's above our own mechanisms for wanting to contain, which is to shine light. And this is the story of Hanukkah, which is so ironic that this terrible event took place on the first night. It's ironic and it's very painful. But this is the whole story of Hanukkah. So the story of Hanukkah is the Hellenization of the culture of the time. Took an irrational approach. Now, it's going to sound rational, but you'll hear why it's irrational. The approach was, we believe in science. We believe in philosophy. We believe in intellectual pursuit. And anything that transcends that has to be eradicated. And if we actually could read in the prayers that we say on Hanukkah, it says that the desire of the Greek Syrian Empire was lahashkicham Torah secha, to cause the Jews to forget that it is your Torah. They didn't have a problem with Torah. They had a problem that it was your Torah, that it was God's Torah. They didn't have a problem with Jews observing the Sabbath. They had a problem with Jews observing the Sabbath because it's a divine day. I think they call it God's Day, something like that, right? They didn't have a problem that Jews would say, oh, we have to take the seventh day off because it's good for us to rest, so we re-energize ourselves. But don't take it off because it's God's day. One of the other main areas that they attacked were the laws of kosher, the laws of circumcision, and the laws surrounding the observances of the Jewish calendar. Because all of these things, what they all have in common are behaviors that call on us to act in a way that transcends logic. To circumcise oneself in the name of a covenant, I don't think any of us would have been able to come up with that idea on our own. Right? If you wanted to negotiate a covenant with someone, I think we all would have, especially the men here, we would have come up with another way to pull that one off, right? Of all things to do to demonstrate a covenant, the circumcision. That makes no sense. It really doesn't, right? Time. You can't really touch time. And yet what we say is when the sun sets on a given day, now the time is holy. The energy of the time is holy. Again, that's super rational. Kosher. Contrary to what people might think, that kosher is a series of laws for clean food, it's not. Because the food could be dirty if you like, and you can still eat it. And today they produce pork that's pretty clean. Not necessarily healthy, but neither is a lot of red meat. Kosher is a super rational law. It's a divine diet, which makes no sense. And yet we do it because God says so. So their agenda, yes.
Can you remind me of the three different types of laws? Super rational, divine, or the other two?
So there's laws. Laws are things that our sages say that had the Torah not been given, we would have figured them out on our own. What society conventionally uses as, ethical behavior. The second is symbolisms, laws that demonstrate a relationship between us and God. And then the third are divine decrees. And you're welcome. And all 613 commandments fall into one of these three categories. So the laws, the Greeks didn't have a problem with. Even the symbolisms, they weren't too caught up in. They were mostly caught up in the decrees, because that's where our behavior demonstrates something that's beyond our own logic.
I thought they had several gods, and Judaism was one God. When that the God of the sun, the God of this and that.
So it wasn't the issue with one God is not that it's one; it's the relationship to that one God. In other words, when you have multiple gods, if you study the opening chapters of Maimonides, he basically sets the record straight on this. By definition, when you have multiple gods, your gods are negotiable, right? It's almost your God is made in your image, right? That's why I can have multiple gods. Because if there's only one God, then that one God, by definition, is the creator of everything. But if there's multiple gods, that means that one God can create another God, I can create a God. And once I'm creating the God, or one God can create another God, then there's already definition to that God. That's already rational. When we say there's one God, that means by definition that it's a super rational being. That's beyond our comprehension. There's no way we can grasp God using any of those rational faculties. So how did the Jews combat this? How did the Maccabees combat this? And by the way, just historically, the majority of the Jewish people bought into this. They bought into the Hellenization to the extent that in the temple, you want to hear like how radical the Hellenization, how perverted it was. The temple, the high priest's role in the temple during the time of Hanukkah was a purchased position. And it was purchased by Jews who had become Hellenized. It was actually it was the spark that lit the fire that brought the whole story down. So basically, there was a fellow named, if I'm not forgetting if I'm remembering, I think his name was Jason. I think there was Jason and Menelaus, and each one had bribed a Greek Syrian official who was overseeing the land of Israel to purchase the position of high priest. And they started fighting with each other, and word came back to the emperor Antiochus, and he said, okay, I had enough with you Jews. We're shutting down the temple. And they came in, they defiled the temple, and then the rest of the story evolved from there. But listen to this. They purchased this position, and during those years of the Greek-Syrian rule, these individuals would go into the Holy of Holies, as is the Torah's instruction on Yom Kippur. But they weren't very holy people because they had purchased a position and they were Hellenized. But they knew how holy the place of the Holy of Holies was, and they went into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. And what happened when they went into the Holy of Holies? Anybody know? What do you imagine if you're an unholy person going into a very holy place?
It's a bad day.
It's a bad day.
Yeah.
You drop dead. And they would actually tie a chain to the ankle of the high priest who would go into the Holy of Holies, because if after a while he didn't come out, they'd pull him out and he was dead. It's really akin to addiction, right? An addict engages in a behavior using a substance that they know is going to kill them, but they do it anyway because of the high. That is irrational behavior. I'm not judging the addict. I know plenty about addiction. That's not my point. My point is that we can engage in behaviors that are irrational because we're yearning for something, which actually, this perversion is actually very fascinating and in a sense very complementary of the spiritual drive, right? They were willing to give up their life in order to access the spiritual high, even though they themselves were not on a holy level. So how were we victorious in the story of Hanukkah? If you were Judah the Maccabee, or Matisyahu the Maccabee, or any of the Maccabees, what was your approach? Your approach was, we may be small in number, we may have a world that says that we're wrong, there's a world that says we need to adapt, but we know truth, and we are going to stand strong, we're going to maintain our tradition, we're not going to give in. A holy act of self-sacrifice is the most super rational thing one can do. Why? Because what we're saying is, I'm ready to give up my life, and in the act of giving up my life, I'll never be able to do a mitzvah again. Right? At least in this world, I can do a mitzvah. So maybe I should compromise the mitzvah, so at least I can do the mitzvah. But instead we're saying, no, give up your life where you won't be able to do the mitzvah, but you're doing that because you're demonstrating and you're making a statement of connection to a God that transcends all of it. It's the most super rational thing a person could do. But that super rational movement is what combats the irrationality of darkness, the irrationality of evil. And that's why the Maccabees, with a small band of 5,000 soldiers, were victorious over the mighty army, the mighty Greek-Syrian army of 60,000 soldiers. That part of the story is often overlooked in the name of the miracle of the lights. But actually, the miracle of the lights is much more of a symptom, of a result of what the Maccabees did than the main focus of the story. In fact, if you read in the prayers, we don't talk about the miracle of the light at all in the daily prayers of Hanukkah. It doesn't talk, all it says, alludes to at the end, it says that when they came back in and they cleaned up the temple, they lit candles in the holy courtyards. But it doesn't talk about the candles actually burning for 8 days. Of course, that's the main tradition of Hanukkah. But we sometimes get confused by looking at the tradition without getting the behind story. The real miracle of Hanukkah is that there were Jews who said, we're not going to buy into the darkness. We're not going to negotiate with the darkness. We're not going to compromise. We're not going to mediate with the darkness. We're going to transcend that. Which means we're going to go do something absurd. We're going to go fight 60,000 soldiers with a measly Jewish army of 5,000 soldiers. Yes.
Example to the Ghetto Warsaw uprising, in a sense, because he said it was the most rational thing to do. It's like obviously they're going to statistically lose 5,000 and 60,000. So you mean like sacrificing oneself, like although they know nothing's gonna come out of it, but at least like preserve some dignity? Is that like that?
It's not even about preserving dignity. It's doing what you believe in for the sake of the belief. It's not about survival. The Warsaw Ghetto is a good example, but I want to give you a much more simple and relevant example today. It's living Jewishly today. Full stop. Right? It's when you hear about this terrible massacre, and your tendency is to say, I'm staying home tonight. And you say, no, I'm not staying home. I'm going out. I'm going to be as public as I can tonight. That's what it is. Why are you going to do that? I'm not worried that, oh, I'm going to go public and my life's in danger. Obviously, you got to protect yourself. But why is that a movement? Because I believe in something. And I know that darkness, who said that the only thing for darkness to survive is for good people to do nothing? Was that Churchill said that?
Oh, yeah. The only way for evil to prevail is for good men
to do nothing, right? So if I'm going to sit back, then I'm negotiating. But by virtue of sitting back, I'm negotiating, which means I'm giving credence to the darkness. Now, whether we're going to be victorious or not, that's not the point. Now, Torah tells us that ultimately light will prevail. Exactly how that shows up is not always clear. But look where we are, right? It's 2025, and they've been trying to kill us for a long time, unsuccessfully. And not only that, but Judaism, I think Judaism is more alive today than it's been forever. More Jews connect Jewishly. There's more light in the world. It's obviously a very painful day, but I'm not despondent. I don't think this is the end. I think this is a hiccup and a reminder that we have to shine even brighter. I think we're winning, even if occasionally, in fact, the fact that there is darkness that shows up is a sign that we're winning. Because if we weren't winning, darkness would say, yeah, just let it self-implode. The fact that light is spreading, the darkness is fighting for survival. So we can't compromise at this point. We can never compromise, surely at this point. Yes.
So one of the things that I was taught, and I think it's quite beautiful, is that the miraculous element, not to, in addition to, is that the relationship with God, that was it. The numbers didn't make sense, not just from you stand up and you move forward, but also there was divine provision for that, and that God's love and light and plan, that you're doing what's right. That's a medical device. You're following the belief that God has a plan and that you're trying to align with that. So that was what prompted it as well. And then that God has that plan and that it will be executed. Like it is written, it will come to pass.
Yes.
That light will overcome.
Yeah, beautiful. And that's a belief, right? It's a belief, which by definition, belief transcends our logic. But it brings us full circle to the miracle of the lights, the miracle of the oil. And this is why I say it was a symptom or a result rather than the main focal point of the story. When you live super rationally, God meets you super rationally. What does that mean? So just some technicalities about the light. So the the oil that is used for the menorah in the temple is known as the first drop of the olive. Actually, when I'm done here, I'm going to go downstairs and do an olive oil press demonstration for the children. So I'll tell you how olive oil is made if you're not familiar. You take olives and you press them. Now, when you press olives, olive oil doesn't come out. That would be really nice. That would make life easier for a lot of people. What happens when you press olives is olive water. Good morning. Olive water comes out of the olive that you pressed. Now, obviously, mixed into that olive water is oil, because oil is the essence of the olive. But you have to separate the oil from the water. So I don't know what they did in the olden days, but in modern day, we use a centrifuge. And the centrifuge spins until the particles separate, and then the oil separates out, and you take that oil, and that becomes olive oil. Now, back in the day, however they did it, the first drops of oil that came from the olives is what was used for the menorah. The Mishnah tells us there are different types of oils, different levels of oil. And other oils are allowed to be used for sacrifices and other functions in the temple, but the first drop of oil is what's used for the actual menorah. So there was a place that was a 4-day journey from Jerusalem where they manufactured the oil for the temple. Because the oil needs to be prepared in a state of purity. All the people involved needed to be in a state of purity. And when they finished putting together the flasks of oil that were to be used for the temple, they would put a seal on it, ancient seal that says certified kosher for temple use. Huh?
It had to be the U.
It had the OU or the OK, whatever they had back in the day. Certified by the high priest. When the Greek Syrian Empire army came to defile the temple, they knew what this was about. And what did they do? They broke the seals. That was their agenda. They were saying, you're making a big deal out about a kosher oil. We're going to break the seal to show you that we're defiling your nonsense. When they came to the temple to restore after they were victorious in battle, they looked for one flask of oil to be able to be used for the menorah. And all of them, the seals were broken, until miraculously they found one flask. Now, here's the thing. According to Jewish law, if you don't have kosher oil, certified kosher oil, you use, I don't mean kosher as opposed to treif, kosher meaning certified with the high priest seal, you can use other oil. I'll give you another example. Before Passover, in the times of the temple, we brought a Passover sacrifice, right? That's what we commemorate at the Passover Seder. We eat the afikomen, which commemorates the Passover sacrifice that was eaten in the times of the temple. Now, if the majority of the Jewish people are impure before Passover, here's a radical thing, they bring the sacrifice. But if less than a majority of the Jewish people are impure, those people wait until the second Passover, which is 1 month after Passover, where they make up this Passover sacrifice.
Can you take a second and talk about what the point of the menorah was in the first place?
Oh, that's a great question.
Repeat the question.
I'm trying to get him to explain what was the point, the symbolism of the menorah in the first place. Why was it there? Why was it important? I know
That's a
after
great
the
question.
days, I'm talking about from the very beginning.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to the question in a minute. Let me finish let me put a bow on this thought, and then I'm going to address that. So the fact that God let them find one flask, that itself was a miracle. In other words, that's God's way of saying, I recognize the super rational actions that you've taken to demonstrate your faith in me, and therefore I'm going to reward that. I'm going to recognize that by giving you the opportunity to do the mitzvah in the best possible way. And then in addition to that, because this was a 4-day journey from Jerusalem, they immediately dispatched messengers there, but it would take them 4 days to get there and 4 days to get back, which is 8 days. That's why it needed to burn for 8 days, right? That's where the 8 days comes from. And so God made a miracle that this oil burned for 8 days so that they didn't have to use any other oil except the best possible oil for the lighting of the menorah. So again, the point being is that the miracle of the oil was actually God's response to the super rational dedication that the Jewish people had in their faith in God, and a willingness to fight for their faith and fight for their religion and so on and so forth. Which I think the message for us is not to be intimidated. Intimidation lives outside of the essence. And if we shine from the essence, if we let our light out with faith and confidence, we can show up no matter what the circumstances are, with the totality of our being, despite the fact that the world may tell us we're crazy, they may tell us to go hide, they may tell us to compromise. We say, no, we are light, and light needs to shine. And the only way to get rid of darkness is by shining light, not compromising the light. That's what Hanukkah is about, and that's the response to what's going on, what happened in Sydney. So the Mishnah, is it the Mishnah or the Zohar, asks the question, what is the purpose of the menorah? Did they need its light? Did they need the light of the menorah? Now, what's the question? Maybe they needed light inside. So I'll tell you a little interesting anecdote. What shape was the menorah? It's got cold in here suddenly. What was the shape of the menorah? Anybody know?
Triangle upside down.
How do you know that?
Because I've seen pictures.
Anybody want to disagree?
Well, there were two menorahs, right? The ones that were curved
Tell me more.
and what? Oh,
Ones that were curved, yeah.
and the ones that were straight.
Okay. Anybody else want to weigh in?
No, you're saying the two menorahs in the temple?
That's what he's saying.
Yeah, I don't
I'll
know.
tell you if I agree with him or not. Go ahead.
Wrong, but they didn't have the, like, four, kennels on each side. It would be like 3 on each side and then 1 in the middle, so it would be 7.
Good. Anybody else have an opinion
I always think of it as sort of the hand of God.
on the menorah itself? There were seven stems. Maybe God had 7 fingers. Yeah.
I don't know what size it was, but I was fascinated that it's all beaten out of one.
One block of gold. Yeah. Powerful. Okay. So I'll set everybody's hearts at ease. There were 2 menorahs. There are actually a lot more than 2 menorahs. The word menorah means a candelabra. It has nothing to do with the menorah in the temple. The word menorah means a candelabra. The root of the word is ner, which means candle. The notion that the menorah in the temple was circular or angular comes from the Arch of Titus, where there's an image of the Romans carrying the vessels of the temple into exile. However, that menorah, according to our tradition, is not the menorah of the temple. It is a menorah. It was one of the candelabras. How did you have light back in the day? You needed candelabras. So they had candelabras all over the temple. The menorah, which makes sense because you would want to differentiate the menorah from the other ones, as well, the commentators tell us this, particularly Maimonides actually he drew his own picture of a menorah. It's a very block image, but his menorah is angular, and he has triangles and circles, which represent the different, there were these things that the Torah calls them upside down cups, and then flowers, and he demonstrates that. So in the temple, there were other candelabras for light. So they didn't need the menorah for light. So what was the purpose? So the Talmud says it is a sign for those that come into the world that God is in charge. So the menorah, there's a lot of beautiful Kabbalistic teachings about it, but I'll give you just the gist of it. There are 7 branches to the menorah. We have 8 branches because we have 8 plus a servant, a shamish, because we are commemorating the miracle of 8 days. So the Chanukiah, the menorahs that we use, demonstrate that. Now, by the way, the 5-armed menorah is you'll often find in synagogues at the cantor's stand. We light 5 candles during the week when we pray because they represent the 5 levels of the soul. So everybody's right, by the way, today. 5, 7, 8, hand, triangle, circular. Just all in context. So
There was one specific one that we're talking about.
yes, there was one main menorah, the menorah, of which that one was angular.
Where was it?
It was in so there was, in the overall temple, there was a building called the Heichal. The Heichal means the sanctuary. In the sanctuary, there were 2 rooms. There was the Holy and the Holy of Holies. And the Holy of Holies was the Ark. In the Holy, you had the table with the showbread, you had the inner incense offering altar, and you had the menorah. Those were the 3 main vessels in there. So the 7-branched menorah represents 7 types of people. We have 7 emotional characteristics, as we've discussed many times. The 7 emotional characteristics represent 7 types of people, all hewn out of one block of gold, because we all stem from the same source. Even if we have different manifestations and permutations, we all come from the same essence. And the idea of lighting the menorah is to bring down God's light into the different dimensions of human characteristics for us to recognize that we are all really one, and that our oneness comes from God. An interesting thing, there's a beautiful discourse from the same author of this discourse, the Alter Rebbe, who says something interesting. If anybody here is a gold worker, you would know this. I don't, but I'm taking it in faith. Somehow or another, what happens is when you're trying to shape something from gold, so the gold on the bottom actually becomes the gold on the top. Somehow or another, the metal moves. Conversely, the gold at the top becomes the gold at the bottom. So if you're banging with whatever tool you use to create shape, the actual gold that's in the bottom makes its way to the top, and the top makes its way to the bottom. The Alter Rebbe says that we sometimes think of ourselves, oh, I'm at the top. Look at me, I'm a rabbi, I'm an important fellow. Oh, you're just a commoner. The truth is, the guy at the top actually belongs in the bottom, and the guy at the bottom actually belongs in the top. And God specifically creates us in this kind of upside down way to recognize that we have roles to play here, and that I may have an external role, and then I have an essential reality. And if I can embrace that, then I show up in the world with humility. And in fact, the person that in my perception may be, so to speak, lower, actually is higher. I need them in order to reach my own fulfillment. It's a very powerful idea. Okay, so that's Hanukkah. Let's try to finish this discourse. We've got 20 minutes. We can do this. I think so. If not, we have one more week. Or 2, or however many we need. '23. So the many waters we've been talking about represent the idea of the challenges of making a living. And as we discussed, because the body, the animal soul, has a higher spiritual source, so through our engagement with the challenges of life around us, we actually access a deeper dimension of the animal soul, of the material world's challenge, that activates a part of the soul that otherwise would not be activated. And the soul comes to a place of love for God greater than it would have had it not come into the body and experienced the challenges of this world. And that's why it's called the waters of Noach, because we said that Noach means rest. It brings equilibrium, it brings tranquility, right? When we live in alignment, we have peace of mind. When we live out of alignment, we have agitation and frustration and anxiety. So if we live in alignment with what we're doing here in the first place, we find the waters of Noach, we find the peace of the waters of Noach. So the waters of Noach have 2 meanings here. On the one hand, it's turbulent waters that are designed to bring out the essence of who we are. And on the other hand, they're waters that bring calm, because if we navigate the turbulent waters effectively, we get to the place where we actually have equilibrium. And this is the idea of the Hebrew word. The ark in Hebrew is a teva. And we said that teva also means word. So in order to navigate the turbulent waters, we have to enter into the ark. We have to enter into the words of Torah and prayer. And that empowers us to be able to navigate the turbulent waters of the world, to be able to survive through all of that and thrive as a result of it. This is also the meaning of the verse that says, and the waters became very strong, and they covered the mountaintops by 15 cubits. What is this idea of overpowering? They overcame the top of the mountains. This is the idea of the challenges that we might encounter where it feels like the animal soul, like the material world is trying to overpower us, right? We can feel like we're being crushed by the world around us. But actually, that crushing is designed to bring out a part of us that's even more profound, to bring out the soul in a way that it would not be able to be accessed otherwise. If we have a minute at the end, I'll connect that also to the olive oil of Hanukkah. Yeah, there's a very profound teaching from the Rebbe about this. We'll get to it in a minute, hopefully. The result of all this is that the ark, the Torah says, "Vatelach hateva pnei hamayim dafke," that the ark went on the face of the water, right? It traveled, it journeyed on the face of the water. Why didn't it just say it traveled on the water? Was the idea of traveling on the face of the water? In Hebrew, pnei or panim means the inner dimension. In other words, the ark traveled, it caused us to access the inner dimension of the waters itself. So when let's bring all the imagery together. When we enter into the words of Torah, when we enter into the words of prayer, and we become empowered, right? We become plugged in, we're anchored. So then, when we encounter the world around us that seems at first glance to want to crush us, actually able to access the inner reality of that challenge, which is to bring out the best within ourselves, to uncover the light that's within ourselves. That's the whole sequence of this story.
But the whole saying, sometimes you feel like you're buried, but in reality, sometimes you feel like you're in a dark spot, but in reality, you've been buried.
No, I think you're saying is sometimes you feel like you've been buried, but in reality, you've been planted. Yeah, it's a great line. I love that. Yeah. It could feel like you're being crushed, but actually what you're being done is you're being squeezed, right? It could feel like you're being crushed, but you're actually being squeezed to bring out the best inside of yourself. And then the Torah says, Vatorah mateva, that the ark was lifted up. What does that mean? That through the words, through the waters, right? Think about prayer when on a regular Tuesday, you wake up in the morning, everything's good, you pray. Now think about prayer when you're facing real challenge. It's a different type of prayer, right? The words themselves are elevated when you're squeezed on the outside, when there's challenge on the outside. It's a different type of prayer. So the Torah is telling us that the ark lifted up, the words are lifted up because of the waters. Because of the external challenges, the waters are lifted up. The ark is lifted up. The words of prayer themselves, the words of Torah themselves are uplifted. What does that mean? It can sound very overly mystical. It's actually very simple. When I pray, it could be a bunch of words, a bunch of lip service. But what's the whole purpose of prayer? It's not just a bunch of ritual words. The purpose of prayer is for me to be able to use the energy of that prayer to navigate life. If I pray effectively, and then I go out into the world and I encounter challenge, I'm equipped to deal with the challenge. So what happens? The prayer itself, the Torah I studied, now permeates my interactions in the world. We're studying Torah here, right? Hopefully, this is not entertainment for you. I'm not sure that I'm that great of an entertainer, but hopefully it's more than entertainment. And hopefully it's more than just intellectual pursuit. You're experiencing something here. You're developing tools for life. So when you go from here and you're going to encounter something today or sometime this week in the world, what you studied here actually becomes a life and a light for how you're going to navigate that challenge, which means that what you studied here becomes elevated, which means that it actually delivers, it impacts in how we live our lives. So whether it's Torah study or prayer, it's not benign words that we're saying. They actually get life and they actually begin to permeate into our lives and they become elevated through the challenges that we encounter. So that's the whole story of Noah. It's the external challenges of the material world around us that through them, the words of prayer and the words of Torah become elevated and we find equilibrium. We access a part of ourselves that otherwise we would not otherwise access. Now he tells us something very fascinating. So I don't know how many of you pray every day. I do 3 times a day, 4 times on Saturday, and 5 times in Yom Kippur. Thank God that's the sequence, not more than that. So, but here's the thing. You wake up in the morning and you got a busy day ahead. And you go to pray with a minyan, or you pray at home, however you do it. And you start your prayers and say, oh my gosh, I got to do carpool. I got a 9 o'clock meeting. I got to this, I got to that. And you say, I got to get this done. You knock out the prayer. So he says, this is a mistake that working people make. You say, oh, those yeshiva students who get to study all day in yeshiva, they spend the whole day studying and praying, they can pray for a long time. But we working people, we don't have time for prayer. We got to go to work. He says it's a mistake. The opposite is true. That it's specifically working people that have the capacity to pray even greater, even better than the yeshiva students. Why? Because what does it mean to really pray? It means to bring yourself to prayer. To bring yourself to prayer, you have to know what darkness is. If you don't know what darkness is, you're not really praying. You're just saying a bunch of words. I've shared this many times that whatever I studied in yeshiva was nice philosophy until I had to live in the real world. You live in the real world, suddenly principles like divine providence and God's presence and personal relationship with God and trust in God and faith in God and all these things, suddenly they come to life. So if you're a yeshiva student and you're saying to God, I mean, just imagine you're a yeshiva student, your parents are paying your tuition, right? The yeshiva is providing your food for you, and you're saying, God, please provide my sustenance. Okay. Now you're a working person, you're 35 years old, you're out in the world, your business isn't going so well, and you start saying, God, please provide my sustenance. That's a different prayer. You're actually praying for something. So the working person actually has the capacity to pray in a very real way because they're overcoming the darkness. Light that comes from darkness is much greater. This is the meaning of the waters of Noach, which, as we said, they are in a line, the relaxed spirit, which is connected to Shabbat, to Shabbos, because Shabbos is a day of rest. As the verse says, that God rested from all his work on Shabbos. During the 6 days of the week, God is manifest. Like, for example, it says on Sunday, when God created the world, it says, Vayomer Elokim yehi or. God said, let there be light. On the second day, God said, Yehi rakia, let there be a sky. Tachea aretz desha, and then on the third day, God said, let the earth give forth vegetation. In other words, what's going on in this whole process? God is creating. It's action. He's creating light, he's creating earth, he's creating grass, God's busy doing, right? It's a time for doing. Then along comes Shabbos. Now God rests. What does it mean God rests? God needs to sleep. God's not resting, not sleeping. It means God is not engaged in output. When you finish running your marathon and you rest, doesn't mean you're sleeping. When you finish a project and you sit back and you observe what you've built, doesn't mean you're sleeping. You're resting, meaning all of that output is now coming back to the core of why you did it in the first place. It is reflection. Yeah, it's reflection. But it's more than reflection. The energy itself is going back to its source, right? There's this flow that goes from essence outward in order to engage in output. When we rest, that energy goes back, just like when we sleep. The energy goes back to its source and refreshes. Even when we're conscious, if we're resting, meaning we're reflecting, we're pausing after engaging the output, the energy is going back to its source. It's a way of reevaluating why did we engage in this output? It's a satisfaction in looking at that the output was effective, but it's also a reevaluating, are we going to do this again? Right? That's why Shabbat comes every 7th day.
Sorry, the proportion of prayer that you just mentioned, I'm stuck on that. My mind keeps going back. So what you're talking about are, I assume, just the way that you're describing it sound like structured prayers. How does prayer that is more like, God, I can't find my keys, please help me, I'm gonna be late, or that was a really bad decision, please make something good with this, or my heart is broken. How does that fit into, what do those prayers mean in terms of how this is discussed for the scholar versus the
Sure. So in a word, yes. They are both the same. Structured prayer is not intended to be structured. It's a body that needs a soul. Prayer that is spontaneous is a soul without a body. So in either circumstance, we have to bring the other component, right? So daily prayer is a body that needs a soul. It's a bunch of words that are structured, designed that if we bring ourselves to those prayers, it gets a soul. It's a fantastic tool, but it's not intended to just be a body. We're not here just to say a bunch of words. You got to bring yourself to the equation. Conversely, when you have a spontaneous prayer, that's a soulful prayer. And that's great. And one should feel close to God in order to experience that. And there's a place for that and a need for that, because it also demonstrates that God is real in your life, that when you can't find your keys and you talk to God and say, God, help me find my keys, that you believe that God is present enough in your world that he can actually help. And that's great. And I'm not saying necessarily that prayer needs to have, you got to pull out a book of Psalms and start reading, a structured prayer. But the question is, what do you do with that energy? In other words, is this just a floating energy, like, God's your wingman when you're in a troubled spot? Or is there something deeper to that? And that's where when I'm referring to in this context of structure is not, oh my God, I'm helpless, I can't find my keys, God, help me find my keys. But it's, God, I need my keys. Now, why do I need my keys? What am I trying to accomplish? Where is God just my right-hand man when I need help? What does God really want out of this situation, right? That's what we're talking about here. Now, when you're a yeshiva student, you can't find your keys. You're just afraid you're going to get in trouble from the rabbi when you get late to school. But if you're a working person, you can't find your keys and you're not going to be able to get to your job. And now this becomes a loaded event. And that's where the structure comes in. Can I bring God into this equation more than just I have a technical need, but is God really part of the story? And if he is, how is he? And what do I need to be reflecting on? And what's the purpose of this? Which is, as we've been discussing, to bring out an inner dimension of who I am, which is a recognition of God's presence here, not in a selfish way, but in a selfless way, which will ultimately bring out the deeper dimension of love that I have for God. So they're parallel. The question is, where's the starting point? Are we starting with the body or are we starting with the soul? But ultimately, there's an integration there. You're welcome. So just like when a person rests from output, when they celebrate Shabbos, they are allowing the output, the energy to go back to its source. The same thing when a person's engaged in the occupation of making a living in material things, which, as we said, are called the many waters, when afterwards they are transformed through prayer into godliness. In other words, that's what happens. This otherwise materialistic interaction suddenly becomes a godly interaction because you prayed, because you studied, and you recognize that God is in the story. So this interaction becomes a godly interaction. So this causes a relaxed spirit, a calming spirit, an aligned spirit, which is the experience of Shabbos. It says that all the prayers of the 6 days of the week is a radiance from the prayers of Shabbos. Let me explain what this means. I'm repeating what we said already, but when we celebrate Shabbos, we celebrate Shabbat, tapping into the energy of Shabbat, which is recognizing, why do we rest on Shabbat? Because God rested. What does that mean? That because God engaged in output for 6 days of creation, and then he came along the day of Shabbos and God rested, meaning he brought all of that outputted energy back to its source to refresh it, to re-identify what is the purpose of the output in the first place. So at the end of the week, when the sun sets on Friday and we shut down and we go inward, we go into the experience of Shabbat, which means we are plugging into that divine energy that's recharging the whole purpose of output in the first place. In simple terms, when you shut your phone off on Friday at sunset, you turn your computer off, you move into a place that says, why do I do this all week? Why am I engaged in all of this output? What's it all about? When you can pick up your phone and look at your next email, you're not reflecting. But when you can't pick up your phone, when you can't look at your computer, and all you can do is be. I'm remembering October 7th, I wanted to know what was going on in Israel, but I can't open up a phone, no matter how important it is. For me, it's not a matter of life and death in that moment, so I can't open up a computer. So what am I left with? I'm left with my own thoughts, my own feelings, which one would hope would drive me to a place of anchoring in faith, recognizing that God is in charge, that there's a plan here. I can't make sense of it, but I can't do anything about it right now. So therefore, I must go inward. That's what Shabbos is about. When we do that effectively, so then on Tuesday, when you pray on Tuesday morning before you go to work, you're pulling from that energy. And you become energized. Tuesday is going to be a different Tuesday, because I don't have time on Tuesday to pray for 3 hours like I do on Shabbat. I don't have 25 hours to be reflective on Tuesday morning about purpose and so on. But I can pull from the energy that I downloaded on Shabbat, and in a shorter amount of time on Tuesday, I can reacquaint myself with that energy, so that Tuesday will be a different day. So from the radiance of the energy of Shabbat and the prayers of Shabbat, I draw from there to the prayers of Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday to energize me in what I'm going to do in that given day. And that's what he calls Shabbat Tata, the lower Shabbos. There's a higher Shabbos, Shabbos Ilah. The higher Shabbos, Shu Mashiach La'asid Shnikar Yom Shekul Shabbos. In the Messianic era, in the future redemption after the Mashiach comes, it's called a day that is completely Shabbos. Now, what's the difference between one day a week being Shabbos and every day being Shabbos? That means that every day we live in a different dimension. We live in this higher dimension where the divine consciousness is always present. Now, that is a wonderful place to get to, but it's not the reality of our life right now. Reality of life is the lower Shabbos. We strive for that, we hope for that, but our work lives in the lower Shabbos. But there is that higher dimension that we get to, God willing, when Mashiach comes. Which is why the prophet says, on behalf of God, God says, I have sworn not to bring the great floodwaters of Noach on the earth again. Even though those waters came to purify the earth. But it's not necessarily something that we always need to create such a radical purification. In other words, God changed the very fabric of existence as a result of the flood, that we always have this capacity to tap back into that. And that's why God says, so too, I, God, have sworn to not become angry and rebuke the Jewish people again. Because once God has done the purification process, so in the Messianic era, we won't have that need again. Once God did the purification process during the flood of Noach, he empowered us to be able to do the purification process through our engagement in the material world. And once we finish this job, we enter into a state where that process will not need to happen again. Even though you might say, wait, Isn't this a great thing? Through the challenges of the world, we get to access this deep light. So why would we ever want to retire from that? Why would we ever want to enter into an era where there's no struggle, right? Sounds like we're accessing something that's really powerful. Why would we ever want to get away from that? So he says, and that is because there is a greater love that's even higher than the love that comes through challenge. This is the meaning of the verse in Song of Songs. King Solomon says, with my left hand under my head, his left hand under my head, and with the right hand he embraces me. So there's two types of love. There's love that's born from darkness, and there's actually three types of love. There's love that flows naturally. Then there's a love that is born from darkness. And then there's a love that's so essential that it shatters everything. It's so powerful that it flows over everything. And that's the love of the Messianic era. So the truth is, we can't experience that love until we do the work. It's like you have a gradual light that fits into the vessel. Then you have light that comes as a result of navigating the darkness. And then you have light that's so powerful that typically it doesn't fit into a vessel. But if we've done the work navigating the darkness, then God sends that light in a way that we're able to contain it. And again, I think this is the story of Hanukkah, right? Things were peaceful. Then they became challenging. And the Maccabees and the Jews stood strong and they fought the darkness and came forth with light. What did God do as a result of that? Think about it. Before the story of Hanukkah, there was no oil that burned for 8 days. Then, because they fought the darkness, God made a miracle that they were able to see this light that burned for 8 days. It's still not a miracle that you can hold in your hand. It's still a miracle. It's transcendent. But it only happens once you face the darkness. So even though the struggle is good, the love that's born from the struggle is good, it's very powerful, but there's something even higher. We have to go through the darkness in order to bring ourselves into a new dimension where we are able to receive love that's so great, so powerful, that we can experience it in this transcendent way. It's almost like saying, in a relationship, many relationships start out very loving. It's very peaceful. Maybe even a little infatuation. Then it encounters darkness. And if you're successful at navigating the darkness, the love that comes afterwards is far more powerful than the love of the infatuation. But it only happens once you face the darkness and work through it, because then you become a vessel to actually receive this higher level of love. So one would look back and say, I'm glad I went through the darkness because it brought out a deeper dimension of love. But that's not the end of the story. We don't want to stay there. We want to enter into the higher dimension of love. Let me finish this last paragraph, and then we'll take some questions. This higher level of love will be experienced in the Messianic era, like it says, the verse says, for even if the mountains would move and the hills would collapse, my kindness from you will not move, and the covenant of my peace with you will never falter. This is an expression of God's supernal kindness, which is God's love that comes from above. This idea of God's right hand embracing. This is why it says regarding the Mashiach himself, that Mashiach himself will be exceedingly great, meaning that he will come from this dimension of God's greatness, which is exceedingly high, that we are not right now able to receive, but will be able to receive in the Messianic era. Just before I take questions, we will have class next week. We may do some kind of question and answers and float that, and then after the first of the year, we'll start a new discourse, and I welcome feedback. Yes, questions?
About the three loves, are you saying that there's one origin and these are the progressions of it, or that there's separate points of origin and that these are of different ilk?
I would say they're the same point of origin. In other words, it's the love of our soul for God. But let's use our analogy. Love between lovers, you didn't get a new love when you navigated these stages. You've accessed love that was already there, right? It's very cliche, but it's true. It's like you can't love another until you love yourself, right? What does that mean? So in the journey of navigating, so you fall in love with someone. You think this is as good as it gets. Then you encounter challenge and you realize, whoa, and to succeed in that challenge, part of the challenge in getting through the challenge is that we think if I can just fix the other person, then the love's going to be great. And however long it takes till you figure out that it's not the other person you need to fix, it's yourself, right? When I can love myself, then I can truly love the other person. So what happens in that transition? You're actually accessing a part of yourself that was already there, but you didn't know it was there. Then once you access that part, then you say, oh, wow, I really love you now, right? What happened now? Did you find a new love? No, you access the deeper dimension of yourself. So and the same thing is true in our relationship with God. We have love for God. We always did. Then we come down to this world and we encounter challenge. And we have to remember in the challenge that God is present. When we can do that, then we enter into a higher dimension of love for God as well.
There's origin from origin.
Yeah. It's in Hebrew we use the word pnimiut. We're going deeper into the same core, right? The soul has many layers to it, and we live on one layer. And the more we dig in, the deeper we get into it. And oftentimes, the way we get in is through the darkness, through the challenge. Yes.
God's time is basically kind of reversive, looping, recursive. Not that time is most, like, I know some people experience like death charges and things like that. And it's funny, I've heard like autism has more connections to kind of time.
Well, what are you saying? I'm not clear what you're saying.
Like looping time, circular time. A day is just 1,000 years. Okay. The idea of, the forefathers, the patriarchs, lived as if they were living already. But in the belief of, kind of just like the Maccabees that were stepping out in faith and whatever, living as if it is like already not yet, in this kind of like a looping chiral sense, like it already is. So talking about an era that is to come, do you think it's profitable to consider that we may already but not yet, like already live part of us in what is to come, but we live here also. And if that is, how would those interact, do you think? It's like the kind of like maybe like your prayers.
I'm going to answer you briefly, and we can actually, it's a great conversation to have next week because I got to go do something with the Hebrew school. But the Rebbe said something in 1991 or 92. The Rebbe said that Mashiach is already here. All we need to do is open our eyes. And that's a very deep struggle. But I think it speaks to your point, which is not, it's not a simple answer, right? Meaning there's a certain reality that already is here, but we're not living in that dimension. The question is, how do we enter into that dimension? And I don't mean this like woo-woo, like, because there's a real idea that the Mashiach comes, the world is transformed. But in order for us, in a sense, to make that happen, we have to enter into a new dimension within ourselves. We have to move away, in a sense, what it is we have to move away from the struggle, seeing the darkness as something we need to battle, to seeing the darkness as an impetus to bring out light. It's the same end result, but the question is, what's our relationship to it? Are we fighting or are we shining?